The way we understand the Caribbean today is often focused on the packaged holidays, luxury resorts, and private beaches, and it's often understated just how integral the Caribbean once was to the world's economy. The region played a particularly important role in the development of the modern-day globalised world. Dr. Tennyson Joseph tells us what CLR James thought about this through his work and his writing.
James had a theory in which he said, and that's a fact, the Caribbean was the first an example of globalization. So what you call globalization, in which, somebody is, the world is interconnected and somebody transcends the local. The Caribbean slave plantation was the first example of a truly global enterprise, because you had African labor, you had a global economic system to do with Lloyd's and Barclays Bank and the shipping and trading and the insurance company. You had a middle passage, and then you had what was then called Jewish ingenuity, the technology of sugar production. And then you had a kind of, the plantation was a kind of division of labor in which you had specialized skills. And then you had transshipment and thing to England. And then you had a kind of, so what you call globalization today, what you think is globalization as something new. The Caribbean citizen was the first example of a truly global individual. So his consciousness was global because he came from Africa, and there were also Indian indentured and Chinese and Europeans in that small space. So your consciousness is global. So that is and it's not a made-up story. It's a fact.
Darcus Howe's political work is a perfect example to support CLR James's theory that Caribbean people had a global consciousness. Darcus arrived in the UK on the 11th of April 1961, and before the decade was over, he was already attempting to impact the politics of the United Kingdom in a major way.
So Darcus becomes kind of a full-time radical in the summer and autumn of 1968. And we can date this quite precisely because he's hanging around with Michael X in a group called the Black Eagles, which is based at the Black House, which is in Islington, if memory serves correctly. And the Black House was supposed to be a kind of black cooperative that Michael X set up. The problem is that Michael X has criminal connections. Michael X, as far as Darcus was concerned, was much more of a criminal than he was a genuine radical. And it takes a while for Darcus to realize this. Okay, it takes a while for Darcus to realize this. So he's spending time with Michael X for 2-3 months in the summer and autumn of 1968. And then Michael X and Darcus and CLR James all go to the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal. And this is where Darcus meets, who does he meet there? He meets H. Rap Brown, and he meets Walter Rodney. And he spends a lot of time with CLR James. And I think it's at this point that CLR James says to Darcus, you need to stop hanging around with Michael X. He's not doing any good. And particularly, he's not doing any good for the black community. And there are various revelations about Michael X. Michael X's work with Rackman, the notorious rent collector, and the way in which Michael X was essentially extorting money from working class black families. So Darcus breaks with Michael X at the end of 1968. And this leads to a lot of tension between them at the beginning of 1969, to the point where Michael X, either Michael X himself or some of Michael X's people, attack Darcus with a knife. So they're trying to take his life. And this is the moment where Darcus has this crisis about, can he trust members of the black working class? And this is the moment where CLR James keeps his eye on the ball. Darcus calls out Michael X as Red Michael. Red, and what he's getting at there, it's not about race, okay? It's not about race. It's not about the fact that Michael De Freitas has dual heritage. Red in that context is about whose side is he on? Is he really on the side of black people, or is he really on the side of white people? Okay, so that's what Darcus is getting at when he calls him Red Michael. And Darcus basically leaves the Black House. And this is very difficult for Darcus because Darcus has a child, Darcus has a wife, and they've really got nowhere else to go. But he's convinced that Michael X is not a genuine radical, that he's doing more harm for black politics than good, and therefore he leaves that situation. Darcus very quickly goes off to Trinidad, and therefore he breaks completely the ties with Michael X. And Darcus goes to Trinidad. Partly he's escaping Michael X, and partly he's escaping the British police. So Darcus had been putting out a magazine called The Black Eagle, and The Black Eagle went to, I think it was 5 issues. So it took the police about 5 months to work out who was putting this out, where they were based. And essentially a police officer called PC Frank Pulley turns up in Darcus's flat in Shepherd's Bush. He, I think, breaks the Gestetner machine, which is a kind of like an old-fashioned photocopier, for want of a better analogy. So I think PC Pulley kicks the or throws the Gestetner machine, breaking it, and he says to Darcus, if Darcus doesn't leave town, then he's going to be facing some very serious criminal charges. So Darcus takes this seriously, and he goes to Trinidad. He arrives in Trinidad with letters of introduction from CLR James, and consequently he gets a job as deputy editor on the Vanguard, which was the newspaper of the Oil Workers Trade Union. And the Oil Workers Trade Union in Trinidad was a very radical trade union. So they'd embraced Black Power. They'd embraced a form of socialism. So they weren't simply campaigning for better paying conditions. They were a genuinely political radical union. Within a little while of getting there, Darcus is involved in a march through Port of Spain. And this march ends up the authorities end up getting very, very worried about this, and they send the police in. And Darcus and his fellow radicals end up in the big cathedral in Port of Spain, and they paint some of the figures of Christ and Mary and John the Baptist and whoever, they paint them black. Darcus gives a sermon, for want of a better word. It's in a cathedral, so I think we can call it a sermon. And I think to some extent he's channeling his father. Okay, so he's seen his father give sermons, so he knows the form. So he's perfectly, suited to give a sermon. But this is a sermon about how Jesus is a liberator and how Jesus is, how Jesus was on the side of the poor. And it's a Black Power sermon, okay? And it's the occupation of this cathedral which leads to a revolution which lasts 2 or 3 months. And the revolution comes incredibly close to bringing down the Trinidad government. And if it wasn't for the intervention of the American and British militaries, there would have been a second wave of decolonisation out in Trinidad, and Darcus would have been heavily involved in that.
It is especially important to note that the Black Power movement in Trinidad exploded as the masses rose up in demonstrations that rocked the island. The People's National Movement government emerged from the uprising, severely shaken, but still with a firm grip on power. A party founded by CLR James's former student, the historian and Prime Minister, Eric Williams.
You touched on it a little bit, but I would kind of like to explore a bit more the contradiction between, I guess, the Jamesian method and his student, Eric Williams, once he becomes Prime Minister of the newly independent Trinidad.
And now, the answer I will give to that has to do, there's a class question there, as well as the objective reality of state power. And that's something that I think many Marxists did not fully address. And that is one of the lessons, again, of the 20th century collapse of the Soviet Union. People like Immanuel Wallerstein has always been writing in a way very suspicious of state power. State power has its own logic. So I am talking to you now as Tennyson Joseph, but let's assume I were the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. That very office has its own logic. And you understand what I'm saying to you? You have to deal with all kinds, including, especially in the context of the global dominance of capitalism. And I'm being very honest and open with you. The very reality of global capitalism means that you're managing a small state, a third world state. 99.99% of what you do is conforming to the global capitalist order, unless you make a revolution. And even those states that make the revolution are constrained by those realities, okay? So Williams was never a revolutionary. But beyond that, Williams, just to give a classic example of what I mean by constrained. Not many people know. Do you know that Williams, on the list of banned books after the 1970s Black Power uprising, on the list of banned books, is Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, and how Columbus, and from Columbus to Castro. You see the irony of this thing? So Williams, the Oxford intellectual who writes the books, is now confronted with Williams, the Prime Minister, who's banning his own books. You get me? So and by the way, the book banning was crazy. They were even banning Black Beauty. You know this book about this book about the horse. There were people who were walking into the Caribbean. The book called Black Beauty, and because of the Black Power scare, the book was being seized by customs officers who, by the way, perhaps themselves semi-literate. So I'm not saying so. The Industrial Revolution, there's a joke from St. Vincent in which somebody was walking with a book called The Industrial Revolution, and that was banned. That was seized as well by the customs. That's not a joke, these are historical facts, right?
There's a lot of connections that I feel like are very understated, but when you read the papers and the books, you can start to begin to put them together.
Mm-hmm.
One person who died in the uprisings in Trinidad was Beverly Jones.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is the connection between that, between Beverly's death and Darcus's later work with Althea and the Black Panthers and that whole the milieu? I'm not asking the question in a very erudite way, but in the same people who are fighting these the governments in Trinidad are in the UK also fighting for the rights and equalities of Black people on the ground. How do you see those connections?
That is a very good question. I think probably what I would say is, first of all, Darcus was very aware that in any revolutionary situation, women are going to be on the vanguard of that revolutionary situation. And this is something he took partly from his experience, so partly he witnessed it, but also partly from Frantz Fanon, particularly the book Studies in Dying Colonialism, which sets out a kind of theoretical framework to explain why women are going to be in the vanguard of the revolution. So I think there's that aspect to it. And I think Darcus, Althea Jones-LeConte, Olive Morris, and not just radicals from the Caribbean working in Britain, but also radicals in America. I think this is very much a kind of Black Power idea, regarded decolonisation as being part of the same political project as the fight against racism in the metropolis. So Black Power, in a sense, is the analogous or the equivalent movement in the metropolis to an anti-colonial movement in former imperial spaces. So yes. So I think that's probably how I'd frame it.
Darcus's time organising and writing in Trinidad would transform his approach to activism in the UK. This new strategy led to success in the Mangrove Nine campaign and trial, which you can hear about in other episodes of the History Hotline, episode 1 and 2 to be precise. The transformation in his approach also led to the creation of what some might argue is his biggest contribution to Black Britain, the Race Today Collective.
CLR and Darcus, I think if anybody knows any of the history, were very, very close. And one of the reasons that Darcus formed the Race Today Collective, which was housed in this building, is because he was following the political understanding and wisdom of his great uncle CLR, who talked about building a small organisation around a magazine. So it's really fitting that we're unveiling the plaque to Darcus today on CLR's birthday. And Darcus said to me that when he decided to build the collective, he wanted a mixture of intellectuals and activists. And that was very important to him. He wanted working class people as well as intellectuals to come together in an organisation so that they could learn from each other. He was very much against the idea of the intellectuals with their academic understanding leading ordinary people. He believed that we had experiences and understanding where we could govern and decide for ourselves what we wanted to do with our lives. And so here we were, based really from 74, although the collective Race Day started in 73, from 74 until 88. And this was the building. And on the ground floor here was where we had Race Today studios with Jean, who's here today, member of the collective. On the first floor was Darcus with the offices, and Darcus would sit near that window. And on the top floor, CLR James lived. And that really was what Darcus did. He built an institution. And he was very much of the view that we could build our own institutions. We could tell Britain, and at that time it is not the Britain that it was today. I lament when I hear many young people say things haven't changed, because believe you me, my generation, the generation just before me and just after me, will tell you that there's been a great deal of change in Britain. But when we were around, we were involved in struggles. Every day it was a struggle. And here we had a collective of activists who published a journal, but were also involved in campaigns, in housing campaigns in the East End, in campaigns against the police, in strikes, and these were national. We were a national organisation, and this is something really which Darcus steadfastly built. He had, of course, his comrades and his colleagues. Farouk Dondi's here, one of his great comrades, and other members of the collective. I can see Marv and Michael, Claude, all of us who joined together and joined with Darcus, but it was under Darcus's leadership that we were able to achieve what we did. And the fundamental thing that Darcus told us in the very first time when we got together and he decided on the political position of Race Today is that we are not victims. We are not going to let race or racism define us. We are going to define ourselves for ourselves, by ourselves, and say what we want to do and do it. And we can... And this was really important for us because we were young people. I was 23, 24 at the time. Jean was 18. We were young people. And we looked to Darcus and Darcus' influence of CLR to give us a political understanding of what we were doing and why we were doing it. And you will see from the plaque today that we did this for almost 16 years, meeting together regularly, discussing in this organisation. People would visit us. You could walk into Race Today at any time and meet Walter Rodney, the great Guyanese historian. You could, of course, meet Eric, who is here, our great friend Eric Huntley. You could meet Maurice Bishop, who had come to discuss the Grenada Revolution and what liberation in the Caribbean would be about. You could meet leaders from the South African strike and the anti-apartheid movement. And so this was an international hub as well as a national hub. And so when Adai Sebo and Patrick's talk about this is really an important building. It really is an important building. And today, the fact that we can mark this with a plaque to Darcus, I think is really one of the most important days in the life of Black Britain and of Britain generally.
Yes.
Darcus and the Race Today collective became a trusted voice for not only Black people in Britain, but also Black people around the world. So in 1981, after a fire put a tragic end to a birthday party in New Cross, southeast London, Darcus and the Race Today collective became extremely involved in organising around the tragedy.
I think that was a very important moment for Darcus. And the New Cross fire takes place a decade after the Mangrove campaign. And it's really interesting to compare Darcus in 1971 and Darcus in 1981. Because it's only 10 years, but he's a very different kind of political, he's a very different political figure by 1981. So 1971, he's very much Black Power Darcus. And 1971, he's much more like a forensic lawyer in the way he presents himself to the public. So New Cross fire, 13 young Black people are killed in a fire in New Cross. There's a lot of evidence at the time that it's a racially motivated arson attack. Certainly that was Darcus's view. And Darcus helps organise the Black People's Day of Action, which is a march through London. And it's a march through London on a weekday. And it's a whole national campaign. So Darcus is, he's on the bus or he's on the train to Birmingham. He's on the bus on the train up to Leeds or Sheffield. Black people from all over the country are coming. I think 20,000 people march. It's an incredible feat of organisation that Darcus and the Race Day Collective are behind. And Darcus and the Race Day Collective, they're stewarding it and they're leading it, and it's entirely peaceful. Um, and the way it's written up in the media, you would have thought it was just a riot from beginning to end, because the press reports of it are completely at odds with the reality of this peaceful, dignified march. So it's one of these moments where, which would have been a real success for Darcus had the press reported it more accurately. But to give them their due, the television reports it well. Okay, because the television actually, there's a limit to what you can do when the footage shows dignity and peace and resolution. There's a limit to what you can do to turn that into something that's not. So there are these, so you get these different accounts of it. So it's an incredible achievement of Darcus and the Race Day Collective to have organised it. So I think perhaps I'd just end with that.
Mm-hmm. And similarly, in the march in Trinidad and in the Mangrove March, they take a very particular route during that, and they go to Fleet Street, where all of the press are, and they make a moment of, you guys are part of the machine of lies that are being told about us. Here we are.
Absolutely, yeah. So they go through once again the symbolic centres of white power, and Fleet Street is just the response that the marchers get from Fleet Street is it's deeply depressing. There are journalists leaning out of the window making monkey noises. There are journalists leaning out the window throwing banana skins, shouting the most heinous racial abuse. And this is the journalists. These are the people who are writing for the newspapers, which is informing public opinion up and down the country. So as you say, it's the old Black Power strategy again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's a strategy that Darcus used, throughout his whole life.
Darcus's global consciousness and activism made him a target to the police and the Special Branch's Black Power Desk.
What is the Black Power Desk, and what is their relation/fascination with Darcus?
Okay, good question. So the Black Power Desk is part of Special Branch. So Special Branch has a number of desks which deal with different kinds of, or what the police regard as threats. Okay, so there'll be a bit of Special Branch which looks after Trotskyites, or there'll be a little bit of Special Branch that will look after violent animal rights activists, or a bit of Special Branch that looks after IRA activity, or whatever it is. And one of these desks is the Black Power Desk. The Black Power Desk is established in Special Branch in the summer of 1967 in response to Stokely Carmichael's visit to Britain and Michael X's ensuing speech, which gets a lot of press coverage and gets Michael X sent to prison for a few months. So the Black Power Desk is set up in 67, and they're very successful in 67 and 68, and they get a conviction against Michael X, and they get a conviction against Obibi Egbuna, who was the Nigerian playwright who founded the Black Panthers in Britain. So they get both of those off the streets. The conviction against Michael X leads to him going to prison for a few months, and the conviction against Obibi Egbuna is a suspended 3-year sentence. And it basically means that Obibi Egbuna can't do anything in public for fear of going to prison. So the police think that by getting Michael X in prison and by taking Obibi Egbuna out of the movement, they've decapitated it. But what they've done is they've cleared the way for Althea Jones-LeConte, particularly, to emerge as a leading figure in the British Black Power movement in London. And Althea is much more sophisticated in her approach to Black Power, and she's doing lots of grassroots organising behind the scenes. So the police are unaware of her. She's not on their radar, so to speak. So she builds this really strong movement underground. And when the Mangrove March happens, it takes the police by surprise because they thought Black Power was over in Britain. And in fact, Black Power was stronger than ever. Their fascination with Darcus, I think, comes from the fact partly that Darcus is very, very vocal and very public. Okay, so Althea was very below the radar. Darcus is much more public in the way he's taking on the police. And I think that's one of the reasons why Darcus and Althea, when they were working together, was such a successful combination, because they had different strengths and different approaches, and they complemented each other really, really well. So that I think that's their fascination with Darcus, and that's the desk.
I've talked about Darcus being in the wilderness. CLR was his great advisor. And after the Black People's Day of Action and the insurrections in Brixton, which other speakers have spoken about, the special branch and the police were very, very hot on Darcus. And the Times wrote an editorial in which they said Darcus Howe should be made to account for his movements for every single minute of where he was during the insurrection in Brixton. He was followed by special branch officers wherever he went with the New Cross campaign, and he got talking to them, and they followed him even to cricket. And Darcus spoke to them and said, "Why are you following me to cricket?" And they said, "Darcus, we have been told to follow you wherever you go, not only in political meetings, we are following you." He discussed this with CLR, and CLR said, "The British state is after you now, Darcus, in a really big way, and it's time now for you to retreat." He didn't mean to say don't do what you're doing, but that don't make the noise that you've been making, because really the state really will deal with you, and we know how the British state deals with people who they think need to be silenced.